I'm 65 years old and I owe my very existence to the gentlest hands that ever guided a human life into this world. Hands that belonged to someone my own family would later betray in the most cowardly way imaginable. Before this heart condition takes what little time I have left, I need someone to know about my mother, Mary Catherine Brennan, about the December night in 1960 when she was left to die alone in a mining cabin deep in the Kentucky mountains, and about the being who saved both our lives when every human who should have protected us chose to abandon us instead. My name is Thomas Brennan, and the story of my birth is also the story of how I learned that courage, compassion, and medical knowledge exist in forms that human civilization has never been brave enough to acknowledge. What happened on December 15, 1960, in a one-room cabin on Blackberry Ridge, challenged everything the world thought it knew about intelligence, consciousness, and what kinds of beings possess the wisdom to preserve life when death seems inevitable. My mother was 19 years old when her husband Jimmy Brennan left her alone during the worst labor complications any woman could face. 8 miles from the nearest neighbor, and 15 miles from the closest doctor, in the middle of a winter storm that had already dumped 2 feet of snow and showed no signs of stopping. Jimmy worked the coal mines like his father and grandfather before him, but he'd inherited none of their courage when it came to accepting responsibility for the lives that depended on him. "She's been in labor for 18 hours, Jimmy would later tell anyone who'd listen, justifying his decision to abandon his wife when she needed him most. Baby wasn't coming right, and Mary Catherine was bleeding something awful. I knew I had to get help, had to ride down to Hazard and bring back Doc Morrison before we lost them both. But I know the truth because my mother told me the truth during the last years of her life, when dying from the lung disease that claimed so many coal families made her determined to set the record straight about what really happened that December night. Jimmy didn't leave to get help. Jimmy left because he was terrified of watching his wife die in childbirth, because he couldn't bear the responsibility of trying to save lives he had no idea how to protect. He looked at me bleeding and screaming, and he just broke, my mother would tell me years later, her voice carrying forgiveness that Jimmy never earned. He put on his coat and told me he'd be back with the doctor, but I could see in his eyes that he was running away from something too big and scary for him to handle. What Jimmy couldn't handle was breech birth complications that were killing both his wife and unborn son in a cabin so isolated that screams for help would never reach human ears capable of providing assistance. My mother spent 6 hours alone after Jimmy's departure, feeling her strength ebbing with each contraction, knowing that she was going to die and that her baby would die with her. That's when he came. The being my mother would spend the rest of her life referring to as my guardian angel, though angels, according to her description, were never 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, or possessed of medical knowledge that surpassed anything human doctors could provide in emergency situations. For 4 hours, from 2 a.m. until dawn, this impossible creature worked to save our lives using techniques that combined intuitive understanding of human physiology with herbal medicines that eased my mother's pain and strengthened her body for the physical demands of difficult childbirth. He spoke to her in a voice that was unmistakably intelligent and compassionate, explaining what he was doing and why, preparing her for the procedures required to extract me safely from a birth position that should have killed us both. He had hands like a surgeon, my mother would tell me, holding her own hands up to demonstrate the gentleness and precision she remembered from that night, but hands connected to eyes that understood suffering in ways no human doctor ever could, because he'd seen what happens when mothers die alone and nobody comes to help. I was born at 6:47 a.m. on December 16, 1960, delivered by someone whose very existence challenged everything science claimed to know about North American wildlife, but whose skill and compassion made the difference between life and death for both my mother and me. He stayed with us through my first feeding, through the critical hours when newborn survival depends on warmth and proper breathing, through the beginning of the bond between mother and child that would define both our lives. Jimmy returned 3 days later with Doc Morrison, expecting to find corpses but discovering instead a healthy mother, nursing a healthy baby in a cabin that showed clear evidence of expert medical intervention by someone who understood emergency obstetrics better than most trained physicians. But instead of gratitude for the miracle that had preserved his family, Jimmy chose fear and ignorance, Within a week, he'd contacted federal authorities about unusual wildlife activity in the area, leading to hunting expeditions that would destroy the being who'd saved our lives and demonstrate just how little humanity really exists in the hearts of people who call themselves civilized. The heart condition that's killing me started the day I learned what really happened to my guardian angel, and it's grown stronger every year since, as I've lived with the knowledge that I survived only because someone greater than any human was willing to risk everything to protect innocent lives. My existence is testimony to compassion that transcends species, and my shame comes from belonging to a family that repaid that kindness with betrayal. December 15th, 1960, started as one of those Kentucky winter days when the sky hangs low and gray, promising snow that would trap families in mountain cabins for weeks at a time. My mother, Mary Catherine, had been feeling labor pains since dawn, but they were irregular enough that she and Jimmy convinced themselves they had time to prepare properly for my arrival. Time to boil water, gather clean linens, and maybe even make the dangerous winter journey down to Hazard where Doc Morrison could provide professional medical assistance. By noon, however, the contractions had intensified to the point where travel was impossible, and the snow that had been threatening all morning began falling in earnest, sealing off their cabin on Blackberry Ridge from any possibility of outside help. The nearest neighbors, the Henderson family, lived 8 miles away along mountain roads that became impassable in weather like this, and Doc Morrison might as well have been in another state, for all the good his medical knowledge could do. Jimmy spent the afternoon pacing their one-room cabin like a caged animal, alternately trying to comfort Mary Catherine and checking the weather for signs that the storm might break enough to allow an escape route to civilization. But as evening approached and my mother's condition deteriorated, he was forced to confront the reality that he might lose both wife and child to complications he had no idea how to manage. "The baby's not positioned right," Mary Catherine gasped during one particularly severe contraction, her medical knowledge limited to what her mother and grandmother had shared about the dangers that could make childbirth fatal even for young, healthy women. "Something's wrong, Jimmy. I can feel it. The baby's not coming the way it's supposed to." My mother was experiencing what medical textbooks call a frank breech presentation, with my buttocks positioned to emerge first instead of my head, creating complications that challenged even experienced obstetricians working in fully equipped hospitals. In a mountain cabin with no medical supplies, no communication with professional help, and no experience with emergency obstetrics, breech birth was often a death sentence for both mother and child. Jimmy's panic was complete and immediate. Instead of remaining calm and trying to assist his wife through the crisis, he began gathering his winter clothes with the frantic energy of someone who'd decided that flight was his only option for survival. "I'm going for Doc Morrison," he announced, already putting on his heavy coat. "The storm's not that bad yet. If I ride hard, I can make it to Hazard and bring help back before morning." But Mary Catherine understood what Jimmy refused to acknowledge. The storm was intensifying by the hour, the roads were already dangerous for experienced riders under ideal conditions, and the round trip to Hazard would take at least 10 hours, even if everything went perfectly. Jimmy wasn't going for help. He was abandoning her to die alone rather than witness the suffering he was too weak to endure. "Don't leave me, Jimmy," she pleaded, as another contraction racked her body. "I'm scared, and I need you here with me. If something happens, if the baby comes wrong, I need you to help me." Jimmy's response revealed the cowardice that would define his character for the remaining years of his life. Instead of acknowledging his wife's desperation, instead of accepting responsibility for the lives that depended on him, he convinced himself that abandoning her was actually an act of heroism. "I'll be back before dawn with the doc," he promised, kissing her forehead while avoiding her eyes. "You just hold on, Mary Catherine. Don't let that baby come until I get back with proper help." The door closed behind Jimmy at 8 p.m., and my mother understood with absolute clarity that she would never see him alive again. Not because the storm would kill him, though that was certainly possible, but because Jimmy Brennan was the kind of man who would find excuses to stay away until someone else had dealt with the crisis he was too frightened to face. For the next 6 hours, my mother labored alone in conditions that would have challenged trained medical professionals. The contractions intensified beyond anything she'd experienced. The bleeding increased to levels that indicated serious internal complications, and my positioning in her womb created blockages that prevented normal delivery while threatening both our lives. By 2 a.m., Mary Catherine had reached the point where she understood she was dying. Her strength was failing. Her body was shutting down from blood loss and exhaustion, and I was clearly in distress from prolonged labor that wasn't progressing toward successful delivery. She began praying, not for rescue, because rescue was impossible in their isolated location, but for enough strength to survive until morning so that Jimmy might find their bodies and at least know that she'd fought until the end. That's when she heard footsteps on the cabin porch. Heavy footsteps that suggested someone much larger than Jimmy, moving with deliberate care that indicated concern for her welfare, rather than casual approach to what might be an abandoned building. The footsteps circled the cabin once, paused at the windows as if evaluating the situation inside, then approached the door with obvious intent to enter. "Jimmy?" Mary Catherine called weakly, hoping against hope that her husband had somehow returned with help, even though the footsteps sounded nothing like his familiar gait. The door opened slowly, and my mother found herself looking at something that challenged every assumption she held about what kinds of beings might exist in the Kentucky mountains. Standing in the doorway, snow covering his massive frame like a shroud, was someone who belonged in folklore rather than reality, but whose eyes held intelligence, compassion, and immediate understanding of the medical crisis unfolding before him. "Don't be afraid," he said in a voice that was unmistakably gentle despite its alien resonance. "I'm here to help you and your baby survive this night." The being who entered our cabin that December night moved with the confident precision of someone who'd attended countless difficult births and understood exactly what needed to be done to save lives that hung in the balance. My mother's initial terror, a natural response to encountering something that existed far outside normal human experience, was immediately replaced by relief as she recognized that help had arrived from the most unexpected source imaginable. "My name is Ezekiel," he said while removing snow from his massive frame and assessing my mother's condition with eyes that held depths of medical knowledge. "I've been watching your cabin since the storm began, waiting to see if your mate would return with human help. When I understood that you'd been abandoned, I knew I had to intervene before you and your child died from his cowardice." Ezekiel stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur that showed gray highlights around his face and hands, but his bearing was unmistakably that of someone with extensive medical training and deep compassion for suffering beings. He moved through our small cabin with careful attention to my mother's comfort, speaking constantly to explain what he was observing and what procedures would be necessary to ensure our survival. "Your baby is positioned buttocks first, which makes normal delivery impossible," Ezekiel explained while examining my mother with hands that were remarkably gentle despite their obvious strength. "I'm going to need to help turn the child internally, then guide the delivery process to prevent injury to both of you. This will be painful, but it's the only way to save your lives." The medical knowledge Ezekiel demonstrated over the following hours surpassed anything human doctors could have provided under similar circumstances. He'd brought supplies, herbal medicines prepared specifically for easing labor pain, tools fashioned from materials I wouldn't recognize until decades later, and techniques for managing breech birth that combined traditional obstetrics with innovations that seemed centuries ahead of 1960s medical practice. "I've been attending difficult births for 30 years, Ezekiel told my mother while preparing medicines that would strengthen her body for the physical demands ahead. "My people have been protecting human mothers in situations exactly like yours for generations, though we usually remain hidden to avoid the hunting that follows when your kind learns of our existence." My mother's labor continued under Ezekiel's care, but transformed from desperate struggle against death into manageable medical procedure, guided by someone who understood both human physiology and the emotional support necessary for successful delivery. He sang to her during the worst contractions, songs in his own language that seemed to carry pain away and replace it with strength, drawn from sources beyond her own depleted resources. "Your people and my people aren't so different when it comes to protecting children," Ezekiel observed while monitoring my progress through techniques that required no instruments but provided detailed information about my condition. "All mothers deserve help during their most vulnerable hours. regardless of what species brings them into the world. The breakthrough came around 4 a.m., when Ezekiel's careful manipulation finally positioned me properly for delivery. Using pressure points and massage techniques that relaxed muscles while maintaining adequate blood flow, he guided my emergence into the world with skills that made the impossible seem routine. "Here comes your son," Ezekiel announced as my head finally crowned after hours of complicated positioning. "He's strong, he's breathing well, and he's going to survive this night because his mother fought harder than any warrior I've ever encountered." My birth at 6:47 a.m. was attended by someone whose very existence challenged everything science claimed to know about North American wildlife, but whose knowledge and compassion made the difference between life and death for both my mother and me. Ezekiel cut my umbilical cord with tools he'd fashioned specifically for this purpose, cleaned and warmed me with techniques that demonstrated understanding of newborn physiology, and placed me against my mother's chest with the reverence of someone who understood the sacred nature of the mother-child bond. "He's perfect," my mother whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face as she held me for the first time. "Ezekiel, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You saved both our lives when everyone else abandoned us." But Ezekiel's care didn't end with successful delivery. He remained with us through my first feeding, teaching my mother techniques for ensuring adequate milk production despite her exhaustion and malnutrition. He prepared additional medicines designed to prevent infection and promote healing from the trauma of difficult birth. Most importantly, he provided companionship during the critical first hours when maternal bonding establishes the psychological foundation for healthy child development. "Your husband will return soon, probably with human medical help that will no longer be needed," Ezekiel predicted while preparing to leave our cabin as dawn approached. "When he does, you must never tell him or anyone else about my assistance. My people survive by remaining hidden from yours, and knowledge of our medical abilities would bring hunters who would destroy our families to capture our knowledge." My mother promised to protect Ezekiel's secret, and she honored that promise for 3 days. But Jimmy's reaction to finding his family alive and healthy, when he'd expected to bury corpses, triggered questions that my mother answered with innocent honesty, never imagining that her gratitude would lead to betrayal of the being who'd saved our lives. "Someone helped us," she told Jimmy when he demanded explanations for our survival. "A doctor came during the storm and delivered the baby safely. I don't know how he found us or where he went, but Thomas and I would be dead without his skill and kindness." Jimmy's suspicion was immediate and paranoid. Instead of gratitude for our survival, he focused on the impossibility of any human doctor reaching our cabin during the storm, and began investigating with the determination of someone who suspected supernatural intervention in his family's affairs. Jimmy Brennan's investigation into our survival began within hours of his return to find my mother nursing a healthy baby in a cabin that showed clear evidence of professional medical intervention by someone with skills far beyond anything available in rural Kentucky. Instead of relief that his wife and child had survived his abandonment, Jimmy became obsessed with identifying the mysterious doctor who'd appeared during the worst storm in decades to perform emergency obstetrics that saved lives he'd been too cowardly to protect. The evidence troubled him in ways that revealed more about his character than about the miracle he was investigating. Medical supplies had been used that weren't part of their cabin's modest first aid kit. Herbal preparations remained that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of obstetric medicine. Most disturbing to Jimmy's small mind were footprints around the cabin that were far larger than any human could produce, pressed deep enough into snow to indicate body weight that challenged his understanding of what kinds of beings might possess medical knowledge. "Mary Catherine, you need to tell me exactly who helped you," Jimmy demanded during increasingly hostile interrogations of his wife, his voice carrying the accusation that she was deliberately concealing information he deserved to know. Nobody could have reached this cabin during that storm, and no doctor in Hazard knows enough about birthing babies to handle what you went through. My mother's responses were honest but incomplete, limited by her promise to protect Ezekiel's identity and her own inability to fully comprehend what she'd experienced during those crucial hours. She described a tall man with extensive medical knowledge who'd spoken kindly while providing expert assistance, but she carefully omitted details about his appearance that would have immediately triggered Jimmy's paranoia about supernatural intervention. He said his name was Ezekiel, and he knew exactly how to help when the baby wouldn't come right. My mother explained, unaware that her honesty was providing Jimmy with information he'd use to destroy the being who'd saved our lives. I never asked where he came from or how he found us. I was just grateful that someone with medical knowledge arrived when we needed help most. But Jimmy's suspicions extended beyond skepticism about human doctors traveling through winter storms. The footprints around our cabin, the unusual medical supplies, and my mother's obviously incomplete account of her mysterious helper suggested intervention by forces that existed outside normal human experience. Jimmy began asking questions around Hazard about large, unidentified individuals who might possess advanced medical knowledge and operate in wilderness areas during extreme weather conditions. The responses he received connected our situation to stories that had been circulating through Appalachian communities for generations, tales of forest dwellers who occasionally intervened in human emergencies, providing assistance that saved lives while maintaining strict secrecy about their existence. Old-timers spoke about mountain doctors who appeared during medical crises that were beyond human ability to resolve, then disappeared without leaving traces that might lead to their discovery. "There's something living in these mountains that ain't entirely human," Silas Henderson confided to Jimmy during a conversation at the company store in Hazard. "My grandfather told stories about them helping women during hard births, setting broken bones for injured miners, even bringing medicine during disease outbreaks when regular doctors couldn't reach isolated families." Instead of recognizing these stories as evidence of benevolent beings who deserved protection rather than hunting, Jimmy saw opportunities for fame and possibly financial reward from exposing creatures whose existence would attract national attention. He began corresponding with federal agencies that investigated reports of unusual wildlife activity, describing our situation as evidence of unknown large primates operating in Kentucky wilderness areas. The response from Washington exceeded Jimmy's expectations. Within 2 weeks, specialists from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had arrived in Hazard to investigate reports of unidentified bipedal entities, providing medical assistance to isolated human families. Jimmy's account of our survival, combined with physical evidence from our cabin site, triggered classified research protocols designed to locate and capture beings whose abilities represented potential strategic value. My mother watched this development with growing horror, understanding that her husband's investigation was leading toward hunting expeditions that would target the being who'd saved our lives. She tried to convince Jimmy that pursuing his mysterious doctor would bring nothing but tragedy, but her pleas only reinforced his conviction that she was concealing information about supernatural intervention that demanded federal investigation. "Mary Catherine, you don't understand the bigger picture here," Jimmy explained with the condescending tone of someone who considered himself intellectually superior to his 19-year-old wife. "If there's something living in these mountains with medical knowledge that advanced, the government needs to know about it. This could be important for national security, maybe even for developing new medical techniques." The hunting expeditions began in March 1961, when specialized teams equipped with tranquilizer weapons and containment equipment established operations throughout the region where our cabin was located. They used Jimmy as a guide to areas where unusual activity had been reported, following trail systems and investigating cave complexes where large beings might maintain permanent settlements. But the most tragic aspect of Jimmy's betrayal was his willingness to use my mother and me as bait for attracting Ezekiel's attention. Federal agents convinced Jimmy that returning to our isolated cabin with his family might draw protective response from whoever had provided medical assistance, creating opportunities for capture that would advance both scientific knowledge and Jimmy's financial compensation as an informant. "If this creature really cares about your wife and son, he'll come to investigate when he sees you've returned to the area," Agent Morrison explained to Jimmy while outlining strategies for making contact with beings who demonstrated medical capabilities beyond human understanding. "All you need to do is create the appearance of a medical emergency that might require intervention by someone with advanced healing knowledge." Jimmy agreed to this plan without considering the consequences for his family or for the being who'd saved our lives. His cowardice during my birth had evolved into something far worse: active collaboration with people who would destroy innocence to advance research objectives that valued discovery over the welfare of conscious beings who deserved protection rather than capture. March 23, 1961, was the day my father's cowardice and greed finally destroyed the being who'd saved both our lives, when federal agents used Jimmy's knowledge of Ezekiel's compassionate nature to set a trap that would condemn our family's protector to 40 years of imprisonment in research facilities designed for studying biological anomalies of strategic importance to national security interests. The plan was diabolically simple in its exploitation of the very qualities that had made Ezekiel willing to risk exposure to help a desperate mother. Jimmy would return to our cabin on Blackberry Ridge with my mother and me, then stage a medical emergency that would draw a protective response from whoever had provided assistance during my birth. Federal agents positioned throughout the area would then capture any unusual beings who approached our location offering help. "It's perfectly safe," Agent Morrison assured my mother, while explaining her role in the operation, his voice carrying the false comfort that bureaucrats use when enlisting civilians in activities they don't fully understand. "You'll simply be camping with your family while we monitor the area for unusual wildlife activity. If anything approaches your cabin, we'll handle the situation with non-lethal methods designed to preserve specimens for scientific study." My mother's horror at this plan was complete and immediate. She understood that Jimmy's investigation had evolved into active hunting of the being who demonstrated nothing but kindness toward our family, and she refused to participate in activities designed to repay Ezekiel's compassion with capture and imprisonment. "He saved our lives when my husband abandoned us," my mother told Agent Morrison, her voice carrying determination that surprised everyone present. "I won't be part of any plan designed to hurt someone who risked everything to help me and my baby survive." But my mother's objections were overruled by Jimmy's eagerness to cooperate with federal authorities who'd promised financial compensation and possible relocation assistance in exchange for his help in locating beings whose medical knowledge represented strategic opportunities. Jimmy had legal authority over family decisions, and he used that authority to force my mother's participation in activities she knew were morally wrong. The trap was set on March 20th, when our family returned to the cabin where I'd been born 3 months earlier. Jimmy had been instructed to create the appearance of urgent medical need, staging accidents or illnesses that might attract intervention from beings who demonstrated protective response to human suffering in isolated circumstances. But what none of the federal agents understood was that Ezekiel possessed intelligence and observational skills that made their crude deception obvious from the moment we arrived on Blackberry Ridge. He'd been monitoring federal activity in the area for weeks, studying their equipment and tactics, understanding that my father's inquiries about his identity had triggered systematic hunting by people who saw him as a specimen rather than a person. Ezekiel came anyway. Despite knowing that our return was clearly bait for a trap, despite understanding that approaching our cabin would probably cost him his freedom, he emerged from hiding when Jimmy's staged accident created the appearance that I was suffering from injuries that required immediate medical attention. "I know this is a deception," Ezekiel said, as he emerged from the tree line with his hands raised in surrender, speaking directly to the federal agents who surrounded our cabin with weapons trained on his massive frame. "I know you've been hunting me since this man betrayed my kindness to his family, but I cannot ignore the possibility that this child might actually need help." His surrender was voluntary and dignified, demonstrating the moral courage that Jimmy would never possess. Instead of fleeing to preserve his own freedom, instead of allowing the possibility that I might be genuinely injured to go uninvestigated, Ezekiel chose to risk everything to ensure that the baby he'd delivered was safe from harm. Agent Morrison's response revealed the mindset that made negotiation impossible. "Sir, you're an unidentified biological entity that poses potential risks to national security. You'll be detained for comprehensive study and evaluation by qualified scientific personnel." What followed was the systematic dehumanization of the most compassionate being I've ever known. Ezekiel was tranquilized despite offering no resistance, loaded into containment equipment designed for dangerous animals, and transported to research facilities where he would spend the remainder of his life as a subject for studying anomalous physiological capabilities that might have military applications. My mother's breakdown as they loaded Ezekiel into the transport vehicle was complete and heartbreaking. She screamed for them to release the being who'd saved our lives, tried to throw herself between him and his captors, and had to be physically restrained while federal agents completed their specimen collection procedures. "He helped us," she cried as the vehicle disappeared into the distance. "He saved my baby's life when everyone else abandoned us, and this is how you repay his kindness. This is how human beings treat someone who showed us mercy when we needed it most." Jimmy's response to his wife's anguish revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy. Instead of acknowledging that his actions had condemned our family's protector to imprisonment, he focused on the financial compensation he'd receive for his cooperation with federal authorities. "Mary Catherine, you need to understand that this was necessary for national security," Jimmy explained while counting money that represented the price of Ezekiel's freedom. "These creatures might be dangerous, and the government has a right to study them to protect American families. My mother never forgave Jimmy for his betrayal of the being who'd saved our lives, and their marriage effectively ended the day Ezekiel was captured. She spent the remaining years of her life consumed by guilt and sorrow, knowing that her honest answers to Jimmy's questions had provided the information that guided federal agents to our protector. For 65 years, I've lived with the knowledge that I owe my existence to someone who spent most of his life imprisoned, because my father chose money over gratitude, fear over courage, and institutional approval over basic human decency. Somewhere in underground laboratories that don't officially exist, the being who guided me into this world with gentle hands and compassionate wisdom has been systematically studied by people who will never understand the beauty they destroyed. The heart condition that's killing me started beating irregularly the day I learned what happened to Ezekiel, and it's been trying to stop ever since. I've spent 65 years knowing that I survived only because someone greater than any human was willing to risk everything to protect innocent life, and that my survival led directly to the imprisonment of the most loving soul I'll ever encounter.